history of the British Isles is written in the ink of royalty, but its most profound chapters are often sealed with the silence of the grave. To wear the crown was to invite both divine right and mortal peril. We begin our journey through the corridors of time, peeling back the layers of myth and stone to reveal the final tragic moments of women who shaped a nation. From the ancient mist of tribal uprisings to the cold stone floors of the tower, these are the accounts of queens whose reigns ended not in peace, but in the shadow of tragedy. Our story begins in the 1st century with Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni. After the death of her husband and a harsh betrayal by Roman authorities, she rose in defiance and led a powerful rebellion that nearly broke the empire's control over Britain. For a moment, it seemed the Roman grip on the island might collapse, but the fortunes of war can change quickly. At the Battle of Watling Street, Roman forces ultimately defeated the rebel army. After the battle, Boudica disappeared from the historical record, and the uprising came to an end, leaving behind the memory of a leader who dared to challenge one of the greatest empires in history. Fast forward through centuries of conflict to the year 1553. Lady Jane Grey, a teenage scholar of immense intellect, was thrust onto the throne as a pawn in a dangerous game of succession. Her reign lasted a mere 9 days before the political winds shifted, branding her a usurper. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, Jane prepared for the end with a stoicism that defied her youth. On the morning of her execution, she walked to the scaffold with her prayer book in hand, a sacrificial lamb at the altar of religious and dynastic ambition, caught in a trap not of her making. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry VIII broke the world, found that the king's favour was as fleeting as a summer breeze. Accused of treason and adultery in a trial designed for her destruction, Anne faced her final days with a haunting grace. She famously remarked on the smallness of her neck, a morbid jest that masked the terror of the impending French swordsman. As she knelt on the straw at Tower Green, the vibrant court she once commanded was nowhere to be found, replaced by the cold, impartial gaze of the executioner's mask and the heavy silence of history. Years later, the pattern repeated with Catherine Howard. Barely more than a child, the 5th wife of Henry VIII lacked the political cunning of her predecessor. Her tragic downfall was fueled by the indiscretions of her youth, unearthed by enemies of her family. On the night before her execution, she requested the block be brought to her cell so she might practice how to lay her head. It was a heartbreaking display of desperation and duty, a young woman trying to find dignity in a world that had already decided her gruesome fate before she could even truly live. North of the border, the tragedy of Mary Stuart unfolded over decades. Driven from her Scottish throne and seeking refuge in England, she instead found a gilded cage. For 18 years, Mary was moved from castle to castle, a constant threat to her cousin Elizabeth I. The damp walls of Sheffield Manor and Tutbury Castle became her world, her health failing as she plotted for a freedom that would never come. She was a queen without a kingdom, her letters intercepted, and her every move watched by spies who sought her ultimate ruin in the name of English security. The end for Mary came at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587. Clad in the red of a martyr beneath her black outer robes, she ascended the scaffold with the poise of a woman who had long accepted her destiny. The execution was a clumsy, harrowing affair, yet Mary remained steadfast in her faith until the very last second. Her death sent shockwaves through Europe, marking the end of a long rivalry and the silencing of one of history's most charismatic and embattled figures. Even in death, her story remains a testament to the heavy, often fatal price of royal blood. Even those who avoided the executioner's blade were not spared the tragedy of a lonely end. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, saw her closest friends and advisors pass away one by one, leaving her isolated in the twilight of her reign. In her final days at Richmond Palace, she refused to take to her bed, standing for hours in a state of melancholic trance, watching the candles flicker and die. The woman who had defeated the Spanish Armada was finally conquered by time, and the immense weight of a crown she had worn for 44 years, dying as the last of her line. Much later, Queen Victoria's long reign was defined by a tragedy that began decades before her death. The loss of her husband, Prince Albert, plunged her into a mourning that lasted 40 years. She became the widow of Windsor, a figure draped in perpetual black, overseeing an empire on which the sun never set, while her own heart remained in the shadows. When death finally claimed her in 1901 at Osborne House, an entire era ended with her. She was a queen who had outlived her world, leaving behind a legacy of stoic, enduring grief that shaped a century. These queens, separated by centuries, share a common thread of sacrifice and sorrow. Their deaths were not merely the ends of lives, but the conclusions of chapters that defined the very soul of Britain. As we move forward, we will explore the nuances of their final moments, the political machinations that sealed their fates, and the enduring mysteries that still haunt the halls of palaces and the ruins of castles. The tragedy of the crown is a story that never truly ends, for every throne is built upon the echoes of those who came before and those who fell. Mary I, the first undisputed Queen Regnant of England, spent her final days in the shivering halls of St. James's Palace. Her body, ravaged by illness and the psychological weight of phantom pregnancies, failed her as the cold autumn of 1558 settled over London. Once a symbol of fierce Catholic restoration, she found herself isolated, her husband Philip of Spain absent, and her legacy contested. As she drifted into the final sleep, the religious fires she had stoked across the kingdom flickered out, leaving a crown to a sister she deeply mistrusted. Her death was a quiet, lonely end to a reign of turmoil. Jane Seymour achieved what her predecessors could not. She provided Henry VIII with a male heir. However, the triumph of Prince Edward's birth was swiftly eclipsed by the onset of childbed fever. In the drafty rooms of Hampton Court, the Queen's strength ebbed away just 12 days after her son's delivery. Henry, for the only time in his life, was truly devastated by the loss of a wife. Jane's death transformed her into the perfect queen in the king's memory, a silent martyr to the Tudor line whose sacrifice ensured the succession, but left a void in the royal nursery. Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spanish kings and the discarded wife of Henry VIII, met her end in the damp isolation of Kimbolton Castle. Stripped of her title as queen and separated from her daughter Mary, she remained defiant until her last breath in 1536. In her final letter to Henry, she swore she loved him still, signing herself Catherine the Queen. Her death was shrouded in rumours of poison, though it was likely a broken heart and cancer that claimed her. She died a princess dowager in the eyes of the law, but a queen in the hearts of the people. The fall of Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most haunting tragedies. Within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, the woman who had remade a kingdom found herself condemned by the very man who had once upended the world to marry her. As the morning of May 19th, 1536 dawned, Anne looked out from her window at the scaffold being erected on the Tower Green. Her journey from the heights of power to the status of a convicted adulteress was swift and brutal. She prepared for the end with a terrifying grace, facing the French swordsman with a steady gaze. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was a teenager caught in a lethal game of political chess. Her transition from the throne to the executioner's block was a journey of tragic innocence. In the winter of 1554, she sat in the Tower, refusing to renounce her Protestant faith even to save her life. Her death was not the end of a tyrant, but the silencing of a scholar. As she was led to the scaffold, she famously struggled to find the block while blindfolded, a moment of profound human vulnerability that left an indelible mark on the soul of England. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, was little more than a child when the crown was placed upon her head. Her downfall was as rapid as her rise, fueled by the ghosts of her past and the indiscretions of youth. In 1542, the vibrant queen was reduced to a terrified prisoner. Legend says she ran through the haunted gallery at Hampton Court, screaming for mercy that would never come. Her execution, at the age of roughly 19, remains a stark reminder of the lethal volatility of the Tudor court, where a queen's favour could turn to a death sentence overnight. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent nearly 2 decades as a prisoner of her cousin, Elizabeth I. Her final confinement at Fotheringhay Castle was a slow erosion of her royal dignity, yet she maintained a court in miniature within her walls. The political machinations that led to her death warrant were complex, a web of forged letters and desperate plots. Mary remained a figure of mystery and threat to the English throne until the very end. Her death was a calculated political necessity for Elizabeth, but a personal tragedy for a queen who had once worn 3 crowns. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 was a masterclass in martyrdom. Entering the great hall of Fotheringhay, she stripped away her black outer garments to reveal a dress of brilliant crimson, the liturgical colour of Catholic martyrdom. Her death was a messy, harrowing affair, taking 3 strikes of the axe to complete. The event sent shockwaves through Europe, turning Mary into a legend and Elizabeth into a reluctant executioner. In death, Mary achieved the legacy that had eluded her in life, becoming an eternal symbol of the tragic, deposed monarch who never stopped fighting for her rights. Queen Anne's tragedy was not a singular moment on a scaffold, but a slow, agonizing process of loss. Over the course of her life, she endured 17 pregnancies, yet not a single child survived to adulthood. Her final years at Kensington Palace were marked by gout, obesity, and the profound loneliness of a queen without an heir. When she finally passed in 1714, the Stuart line died with her. Her death was the quiet extinction of a dynasty, a tragedy built upon the small coffins of her children, leaving the throne to pass to the distant House of Hanover. As the centuries turned, the nature of royal tragedy shifted from the executioner's blade to the burdens of duty and the fragility of life. The deaths of these queens formed a foundation for the modern British state, each sacrifice altering the path of the monarchy. From the violent ends of the Tudors to the isolated deaths of the Stuarts, the crown remained a heavy burden. The echoes of these fallen women still resonate in the halls of Westminster and the vaults of Windsor, serving as a reminder that the glory of the throne is forever tethered to the shadows of the past. The Stuart era ushered in a new form of royal tragedy, where the enemy was not a rebel's sword, but the invisible spectre of disease. In the winter of 1694, Queen Mary II, who had reigned jointly with her husband William of Orange, felt the sudden chilling touch of smallpox. A woman of deep piety and intellect, she had navigated the treacherous waters of the Glorious Revolution only to be brought low by a common contagion. As the frost gripped Kensington Palace, the Queen realised her time was short, preparing herself with a stoicism that stunned her physicians and a court accustomed to grander, more violent ends. Mary's death at the age of 32 left the throne in a state of silent mourning. King William, often seen as a cold and distant soldier, was utterly shattered by the loss of the woman who had been his political anchor and personal solace. The palace halls, once filled with the whispers of statecraft, were now heavy with the weight of her absence. Mary's passing marked the end of a unique dual sovereignty and highlighted the cruel randomness of fate, where even a queen could be snatched away in the prime of her life, leaving a grieving husband to rule a fractured nation alone. The crown then passed to Mary's sister, Anne, whose reign would be defined as much by her political triumphs as by her immense personal suffering. Anne's tragedy was one of repeated, heart-wrenching loss. She endured 17 pregnancies, yet not a single child survived to adulthood. Each failed birth was a blow to the Stuart line and a private agony for a woman burdened by the weight of a kingdom. Her life became a cycle of mourning as she moved from one funeral to the next, her health failing under the strain of constant grief and the physical toll of her many pregnancies. By 1714, Queen Anne was a shadow of her former self, plagued by gout and the immense stress of overseeing the Act of Union. The last of the Stuart monarchs, she found herself increasingly isolated as her ministers bickered over the succession. On her deathbed at Kensington, the Queen was so swollen and ill that she could barely move, yet she remained the centre of a swirling political storm. Her death ended the Stuart dynasty, a tragic finale for a queen who had given everything to her country, but had no heir to carry on her legacy, leaving the throne to distant German cousins. The transition to the House of Hanover brought its own brand of tragedy, epitomised by the story of Sophia Dorothea of Schelle. Though she was the wife of George I, she was never permitted to be Queen of England. Accused of adultery and caught in the crossfire of a decaying marriage, she was divorced and imprisoned in the lonely castle of Ahlden. For 32 years she remained a captive, her name scrubbed from the official records of the British court. Her life was a slow, agonising erasure, a queen in all but name, forgotten by the world she was meant to help rule. Sophia Dorothea's isolation was absolute. Within the walls of Ahlden, she was allowed only a small retinue and was forbidden from seeing her children, including the future George II. Her existence became a quiet protest against the cruelty of her husband and the rigid double standards of the era. She spent her decades pacing the ramparts and writing letters that were often intercepted. When death finally came in 1726, it was a mercy, ending a life of forced solitude that stood as a dark stain on the early Hanoverian monarchy, a reminder of the power husbands held over even the highest-born women. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, was a woman of immense intellect and political savvy, yet she harboured a devastating secret. For years, she suffered from a painful umbilical rupture, concealing her agony from the court to maintain her influence and avoid the primitive, terrifying medical interventions of the day. She played the part of the vibrant, healthy queen while her body slowly betrayed her. Caroline's stoicism was legendary. She managed the king's temper and the nation's affairs, all while masking a condition that would eventually prove fatal, proving that the crown required a mask of steel. In 1737, Caroline's secret could no longer be hidden as her condition turned critical. Her final days were a testament to her strength and the complex love she shared with George II. As she lay dying, she urged the distraught king to marry again. In a moment of tragic irony, he replied through his tears that he would only have mistresses. Caroline's death was a profound blow to the Enlightenment ideals she had championed. She died as she had lived, with a sharp wit and an iron will, leaving the king to wander the palace halls in a state of perpetual, angry mourning. Perhaps no royal death struck the British public harder than that of Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1817. As the only child of George IV and the heir to the throne, she was the nation's great hope, a symbol of a brighter future away from her father's scandals. When she died in childbirth, followed shortly by her stillborn son, the kingdom was plunged into a state of unprecedented national grief. Shopfronts were shuttered and the streets fell silent. Her death was not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic catastrophe that left the succession in peril, changing the course of the monarchy forever. The death of Charlotte triggered a desperate race among the sons of George III to marry and produce an heir. The tragedy of the lost princess paved the way for a new era, as the void she left would eventually be filled by her cousin, Victoria. Charlotte's legacy remained a poignant reminder of the fragility of royal lines and the heavy price of duty. The echoes of her passings and the sorrow of the people served as a bridge between the old, turbulent world of the Hanoverians and the dawning of the Victorian age, where the crown would find a new, albeit different, stability. Following the tragic loss of Princess Charlotte, the royal family entered a period of frantic desperation. Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen was called upon to marry William, Duke of Clarence, in a bid to secure the line. Her arrival in England was marked by the heavy weight of expectation, as the aging brothers of the late princess scrambled to fulfill their dynastic duties. Adelaide, a woman of profound quiet strength, stepped into a court still mourning the lost heir. Her life would soon become a series of personal tragedies, mirroring the fragility of the crown she was destined to wear alongside her husband. Queen Adelaide's tenure was defined not by political triumph, but by the devastating silence of the royal nursery. She suffered through multiple pregnancies, but none of her children survived infancy. The loss of Princess Elizabeth, who lived only a few months, broke the Queen's heart and left the succession in a state of agonizing limbo. Each death was a public mourning and a private agony, as the dream of a direct heir withered away. Adelaide's stoic grace in the face of such repetitive grief earned her the respect of a nation, yet the shadows of her lost children haunted the palace halls. As the reign of William IV drew toward its inevitable conclusion, the shadow of the throne fell upon a young girl living in Kensington Palace, Victoria. The tragedies of Adelaide's motherhood meant that the crown would skip a generation, moving from the aging sons of George III to a niece who had been raised in isolation. The transition was fraught with tension and mystery, as the old guard of the Hanoverian era watched their influence fade. The heavy, sombre atmosphere of the court reflected a dynasty at a crossroads, where the ghosts of lost heirs paved the way for a new, uncertain sovereign. To fully grasp the pattern of royal tragedy, we must look further back to the reign of Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs. Her life was a harrowing saga of loss that remains one of the most poignant chapters in British history. Anne suffered 17 pregnancies, yet out of all those potential heirs, only one survived past infancy. The constant cycle of hope and mourning defined her queenship, casting a permanent gloom over her court. Her physical ailments and the emotional toll of her losses transformed the palace into a place of perpetual, dignified suffering. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, was Queen Anne's only hope for the future of the Stuart line. A sickly but beloved child, he reached his 11th birthday against all odds, carrying the weight of a nation's future on his small shoulders. However, in the summer of 1700, he was struck by a sudden and fatal illness. His death shattered the Queen and plunged the government into a succession crisis. The tragedy of a mother losing her final child was compounded by the political realization that the Stuart dynasty would end with her, leaving an ancient mystery of fate and lineage. The death of her son left Queen Anne in a state of profound isolation during her final years. Bedridden and burdened by the weights of her crown, she presided over a fractured parliament while mourning a house that had no future. The silence of the palace was a constant reminder of the 17 children who had gone before her. When she finally passed in 1714, the sense of tragedy was absolute. The crown passed to the House of Hanover, leaving Anne as a tragic figure whose personal sacrifices were never rewarded with the stability of a direct heir. The cycle of tragic queens continued into the 19th century with the arrival of Caroline of Brunswick. Her marriage to the future George IV was a disaster from its inception, characterized by mutual loathing and public scandal. When George ascended the throne, he sought to deny Caroline her rightful place as queen consort. Her return to England to claim her title was met with a mixture of popular acclaim and royal hostility. She became a symbol of resistance against a cold and distant monarchy, but her path was shadowed by the inevitable tragedy of a woman rejected by the crown. The height of Caroline's tragedy occurred on the day of George IV's coronation in 1821. In a scene of public humiliation, the Queen Consort was physically barred from entering Westminster Abbey. As she moved from door to door, the guards turned her away on the King's direct orders. The sight of a queen being rejected at the very threshold of her husband's crowning glory was a spectacle of cruelty that shocked the nation. This public breaking of her spirit marked the beginning of her final decline, as the weight of the rejection took a physical toll. Barely 3 weeks after the humiliation at the Abbey, Queen Caroline's health collapsed. She fell into a sudden and mysterious illness, her body finally giving way to the years of stress, exile, and public battle. In her final hours, she requested that her coffin be inscribed with the words, "To the memory of Caroline, the injured Queen of England." Her death was as turbulent as her life, sparking riots during her funeral procession as the public mourned the woman they saw as a victim of royal tyranny. Her story remains a dark mystery of the British monarchy. These tragic deaths and the suffering of queens like Adelaide, Anne, and Caroline formed a tapestry of sorrow that defined the evolution of the British monarchy. Their personal losses were inextricably linked to the survival of the state, turning their private grief into public history. As the Victorian era began to take root, the memory of these injured and bereft queens served as a somber reminder of the price paid for royal status. The shadows they left behind continued to haunt the corridors of power, ensuring that the history of the crown remained a tale of mystery and loss. The shadows left by the Georgian and Victorian queens find their roots in the deep, troubled history of the Tudor dynasty. Mary I, the first queen regnant of England, ascended the throne with the weight of a fractured kingdom upon her shoulders. Her reign was defined by a desperate, tragic quest to secure her lineage and restore her faith. Twice, Mary believed she was with child, only for the symptoms to dissipate into the air like smoke. These phantom pregnancies were not just personal failures, but public humiliations that left her physically shattered and spiritually isolated in the cold, echoing chambers of her palaces. By the winter of 1558, Mary I was a woman broken by the very crown she had fought to wear. Succumbing to illness, likely influenza or uterine cancer, she lay dying at St. James's Palace, her husband Philip of Spain long absent, and her hopes for a Catholic heir extinguished. The sounds of the Latin Mass provided a final, sombre soundtrack to her life. As she passed, the Tudor line stood at a precarious crossroads. Mary's death was a quiet tragedy, the end of a woman who had tried to turn back the tide of history, only to be drowned by its inevitable progress. With Mary's passing, the crown moved to Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. While her reign is often celebrated as a golden age, its conclusion was a slow descent into a profound and lonely melancholy. The death of her lifelong friends and closest advisors left the aging monarch in a world she no longer recognised. She became a haunting figure within her own court, refusing to acknowledge the passage of time even as her body grew frail. The tragedy of Elizabeth was the isolation of absolute power, where the woman was eventually consumed by the myth she had created to survive. In her final weeks at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth's grief turned into a physical protest against mortality. She famously refused to lie down or take medicine, standing for hours until her legs swelled, fearing that the moment she reclined would be her last. Her attendants watched in a state of helpless reverence as the iron-willed queen stared into the darkness, perhaps seeing the ghosts of those she had sent to the block. The silence in the palace was heavy with the realization that the Tudor era was gasping its final breaths alongside its most iconic and lonely figure. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I finally succumbed to the inevitable. Her death marked the end of an era and the extinction of the direct Tudor line. She died without an heir of her own, a tragic irony for a queen who had spent her life protecting her sovereignty. The crown passed to the House of Stuart, the descendants of her executed rival. The tragedy lay in the quiet vacuum she left behind. After decades of spectacle and strength, the great Elizabeth vanished into history, leaving a legacy of power that was built upon a foundation of personal sacrifice and perpetual loneliness. To understand the sacrifice inherent in the Tudor crown, one must look further back to Jane Seymour. As Henry VIII's third wife, Jane achieved what her predecessors could not, the birth of a male heir. However, the cost of the future Edward VI was the life of his mother. After a grueling labour that lasted days, Jane was left physically depleted and vulnerable. Her story remains a quintessential royal tragedy, where a queen's ultimate success in her duty to the state was simultaneously her death warrant, highlighting the brutal reality of the female experience within the ancient British monarchy. Jane Seymour died of puerperal fever just 12 days after the birth of her son. Henry VIII, a man whose reign was marked by the callous treatment of his wives, was reportedly devastated by her loss. He chose to be buried beside her, the only one of his 6 wives to receive a queen's funeral. The tragedy of Jane Seymour is found in the brevity of her triumph. She was the chosen queen who vanished before she could see her son grow. Her death left a void in the king's heart and renewed the cycle of political instability. The story of Anne of Cleves offers a different facet of tragedy, the tragedy of rejection. Married to Henry VIII to secure a diplomatic alliance, she was dismissed as unattractive and discarded within months. While she avoided the executioner, she lived out her days as a beloved sister in the shadow of the court. Her life was a quiet, enduring tragedy of a woman whose identity was stripped away by a king's whim. She lived in a gilded cage of isolation, witnessing the violent fates of the queens who followed her, always a spectator to the carnage of the Tudor throne. Perhaps the most visceral tragedy is that of Catherine Howard, the teenage queen. Thrust into the spotlight of Henry's aging court, her youthful indiscretions were twisted into treason. Paralysed by terror, she was led to the Tower of London. Legend says she spent her final night practicing how to place her head on the block so she would not fail at the end. Her execution was a grim reminder of how the Crown's favour could instantly turn into a death sentence. Catherine died a child in a world of monsters, her short life ending in the cold, damp shadows of history. These Tudor queens, from the phantom pregnancies of Mary to the lonely end of Elizabeth and the sacrificial deaths of Jane and Catherine, established a legacy of sorrow. Their lives were defined by the harsh demands of a dynasty where personal happiness was a luxury and childbearing was a lethal duty. As we look back, their collective stories form a narrative of high-stakes tragedy where the crown was as much a burden as a symbol of power. The mystery of their suffering remains etched into the very stones of the palaces they once called home, haunting the corridors of British history forever. As the Tudor line flickered out with the Virgin Queen, the crown passed to the House of Stuart. Anne of Denmark, the bride of James I, entered a court defined by intellectual rigour and growing political tension. Though her arrival promised a new era of stability, her life was soon marred by the same patterns of loss that haunted her predecessors. She bore 9 children, yet only 3 survived into adulthood. The halls of Holyrood and Whitehall, once vibrant with the hope of a new dynasty, began to echo with the familiar, sombre silence of mourning as the Queen retreated into her own private world of grief. The most devastating blow to Anne of Denmark was the sudden death of her eldest son, Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales. He was the golden hope of the nation, a charismatic youth who embodied the future of the Stuart line. When he succumbed to typhoid at 18, the Queen's spirit was effectively broken. She refused to believe he was gone, absenting herself from his funeral in a state of catatonic despair. Her own health began to decline rapidly thereafter, plagued by dropsy and a sense of profound isolation as she drifted away from the king's favour and into the shadows of history. With the accession of Charles I, the crown was shared by Henrietta Maria of France. Her reign was defined not by peace, but by the fire of the English Civil War. As a Catholic queen in a Protestant land, she was met with suspicion and malice. The tragedy of her life was one of constant displacement. She was forced to sell her own jewels to fund her husband's failing war efforts. The once glittering court was replaced by the harsh reality of military camps and the constant threat of capture, turning a royal life into a desperate struggle for survival against her own subjects. The ultimate tragedy for Henrietta Maria came with the axe's fall upon her husband's neck in 1649. Widowed in exile, she became the Queen of Tears, living in near poverty in the French court that had once birthed her. Her remaining years were spent in a cycle of religious devotion and failed attempts to guide her children back to the throne. She eventually returned to England after the Restoration, but she was a ghost of her former self, finding the London air thick with the memories of the husband she lost and the kingdom that had rejected her. When the Stuart line was restored and eventually passed to Mary II and her husband William of Orange, it seemed the tragedy might abate. But Mary's life was cut short in its prime. At only 32, she contracted smallpox, a disease that ravaged her beauty and her body with terrifying speed. She met her end with a quiet, religious fortitude that moved even her political enemies to tears. Her death left William devastated and the nation without its beloved queen, proving once again that even the most stable of reigns could be shattered in an instant. by the hand of fate. Perhaps no queen suffered the physical and emotional toll of the crown more than Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts. Her life was a grueling marathon of grief. She endured 17 pregnancies, yet not a single child survived to succeed her. This biological tragedy was compounded by her own failing health. Suffering from chronic gout and often unable to walk, she was carried to her coronation in a sedan chair. Each lost child was a blow to the future of her dynasty, leaving her to rule a fractured nation, while her own body slowly betrayed her under the weight of expectation. In her final days, Queen Anne was a woman isolated by power and broken by illness. The bitter rivalries of her court, specifically the fallout with her close, confidant Sarah Churchill, left her emotionally drained. As she lay dying, the succession was in chaos, and the pressure to secure a Protestant heir weighed heavily upon her. Her death in 1714 marked the end of the Stuart age, a period defined by grand ambitions and even grander sorrows. She passed away in a state of exhaustion, a queen who had given everything to her country, including the very possibility of a future line. The Hanoverian era brought Caroline of Ansbach, a queen of immense intellect and secret suffering. For years, Caroline hid a debilitating umbilical rupture she sustained during her final childbirth, fearing that any sign of weakness would lessen her influence over King George II. She endured the agony in silence, performing her royal duties with a smile while her condition worsened. This stoicism, though noble, proved fatal. By the time the severity of her injury was discovered, it was too late for the primitive medicine of the day to save her, turning her strength into the very instrument of her demise. Caroline's deathbed was a scene of harrowing grit. As surgeons performed agonizing operations without anesthesia, she remained composed, even joking with her distraught husband to comfort him. Her death left George II inconsolable. He famously promised he would never marry again, only keep mistresses, a testament to the complex but deep bond they shared. Her passing was a loss of the true power behind the throne, leaving a void in the Hanoverian court that would not be filled for generations. Her story remains a testament to the hidden physical sacrifices demanded of women in the royal spotlight. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz faced a tragedy of a different kind: the slow, agonizing descent of her husband, George III, into madness. As the king's mind fractured, Charlotte's life became one of constant anxiety and domestic strife. She was forced to act as the primary caregiver while navigating the treacherous waters of her son's ambitions to seize power. The joy of her early marriage was replaced by the grim reality of a husband who often did not recognize her. Her later years were a lonely vigil, spent within the walls of Kew and Windsor, watching the man she loved disappear into the shadows of his own mind. Caroline of Brunswick's arrival in England was marked not by celebration, but by a visceral repulsion from her husband, the Prince of Wales. Their marriage was a disaster from the first meeting, a union of political necessity that curdled into mutual hatred. As George IV eventually ascended the throne, he sought to strip her of her title and dignity. Caroline, defiant and broken-hearted, became a symbol of public sympathy, yet she remained an exile in her own court. The weight of royal rejection began to erode her spirit, setting the stage for a public spectacle that would haunt the monarchy. The pains and penalties. Bill of 1820 brought Caroline to trial for alleged adultery, a move by the king to divorce her. The House of Lords became a theatre of humiliation. Witnesses were paid to lie, and the Queen's private life was laid bare for the world to scrutinise. Despite the public's fierce support, the psychological toll of the trial was immense. She stood tall in the face of her accusers, but behind the mask of defiance was a woman being slowly dismantled by the very institution she was born to serve. Her reputation a casualty of a king's spite and the crown's cold machinery. The ultimate humiliation occurred during George IV's coronation at Westminster Abbey. Caroline, though legally queen, was physically barred from entering the cathedral. She moved from door to door, the heavy oak portals slammed in her face as the crowds looked on. The sound of the coronation hymns inside mocked her exclusion. It was a public execution of her status, a tragedy of rejection that broke her remaining will. The woman who should have been crowned was left standing in the street, a phantom of the royalty she was denied, her heart finally fracturing under the weight of her husband's cruelty. Only weeks after the coronation catastrophe, Caroline fell ill, her body finally succumbing to the stress and bitterness of her existence. Her death was sudden and shrouded in rumours of poison, though it was likely the cumulative weight of a broken heart. In her final moments, she requested her coffin be inscribed Caroline of Brunswick, the injured Queen of England. Her passing was a quiet end to a loud, painful life, leaving behind a legacy of royal scandal and the tragic reality of a woman crushed by the crown's unforgiving machinery. She died as she lived, a queen in name only. Following the turmoil of Caroline, Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen brought a period of quiet dignity, yet her life was marred by the repetitive tragedy of lost children. As the wife of William IV, the pressure to provide an heir was immense. Adelaide suffered through multiple pregnancies, each ending in stillbirth or the death of an infant within months. Her life became a cycle of hope, followed by profound mourning, as the nurseries of the palace remained hauntingly silent. The crown she wore felt increasingly heavy as she faced the prospect of a dying dynasty, her womb a site of constant royal grief. The loss of her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who lived only 4 months, was the final blow to Adelaide's maternal hopes. The Queen's health began to decline under the strain of grief and the physical toll of her many pregnancies. She devoted herself to charity and the care of her husband's illegitimate children, finding a hollow solace in a life of service. Yet, the tragedy of being the mother of a lost line weighed heavily on her. Her presence in the court was one of a grieving shadow, a queen whose primary duty to secure the succession remained tragically and painfully unfulfilled. When William IV died in 1837, Adelaide was cast into the role of Queen Dowager. Her husband's death was not just a personal loss, but the end of her relevance in the political sphere. She moved to the periphery of the court, a woman who had survived the madness of the previous generation, only to find herself a relic of a passing era. Her final years were spent in a state of physical fragility. The pious queen who had endured the deaths of all her children, now watching a new era dawn under her niece, Victoria, while she faded into the archives of history. Adelaide's death in 1849 was as quiet as her life had become. She requested a simple funeral, eschewing the grand spectacle typically afforded to royalty. Her passing marked the end of a tragic chapter of the Hanoverian line, one defined by the struggle for succession and the personal cost of duty. She left behind a reputation for kindness and resilience, but her story remained one of the most poignant in the royal line. A queen whose life was a series of funerals for the children she could never truly hold, ending a reign defined more by loss than power. The tragedy of the British queens then turned toward the young Victoria, whose childhood was a prison of control and isolation. Raised under the strict Kensington system by her mother and Sir John Conroy, Victoria was never left alone and was constantly reminded of the fragility of her position. The deaths of her father and her grandfather had left her the sole heir, a heavy burden for a small child. This era of tragedy through control shaped her into a guarded, iron-willed woman, haunted by the spectre of those who sought to rule through her, making her childhood a psychological fortress. Victoria's accession brought an end to the Kensington system, but ushered in a new form of tragedy: the constant proximity to death within the royal house. Even as she took the throne, the ghosts of the queens who came before her, Charlotte, Caroline, and Adelaide, lingered in the halls of Buckingham Palace. Her reign began with a sense of duty born from the ruins of her predecessors' lives. She was the survivor of a century of royal heartbreak, a queen who would eventually define an age through her own legendary mourning, her life forever coloured by the tragic lineage she inherited. Victoria's early years on the throne were haunted by the heavy silence of the Kensington system and the echoes of her predecessors. Though the crown rested on her brow, she remained a solitary figure walking through the vast, cold galleries of Buckingham Palace. The air seemed thick with the unresolved grief of Queen Charlotte and the public shaming of Queen Caroline. Every decision she made was a reaction against the chaos of the Regency, a desperate attempt to bring order and morality to a lineage fractured by scandal. She carried the weight of an empire, yet the ghosts of the past whispered that tragedy was her true inheritance. In Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Victoria believed she had finally found an anchor against the rising tides of royal misfortune. Their marriage was not merely a political union, but a sanctuary of domestic stability that promised to break the cycle of tragic queenship. For 2 decades, Albert served as her advisor, her comfort, and the architect of a new moral standard for the British monarchy. Together, they rebuilt the royal image into one of family and duty. Yet, beneath the surface of this golden age, the ancient British royal mystery persisted, as if the fates were merely waiting for the perfect moment to strike a devastating blow. The winter of 1861 brought a sudden and catastrophic end to Victoria's short-lived reprieve from sorrow. Prince Albert, the pillar of her life, succumbed to a mysterious illness that the royal physicians struggled to contain. His death at the age of 42 shattered the Queen's world, plunging her into a despair so profound it would rewrite the history of her reign. The palace fell into a terrifyingly familiar silence, the same silence that had followed the death of Princess Charlotte decades earlier. Victoria was no longer just a ruler. She was the supreme mourner of an empire, a widow bound to a ghost for the rest of her days. For the next 40 years, Victoria became the Widow of Windsor, a figure defined by the black silk and lace of perpetual mourning. She retreated from the public eye, turning her grief into a state ritual that governed every aspect of her existence. Her palaces became shrines to the late prince, with his rooms kept exactly as he had left them, fresh water brought for him every morning as if he might return at any moment. This obsessive devotion was a manifestation of the tragic lineage she had inherited, a queen whose identity was consumed by the loss of her consort, mirroring the isolation of the queens who preceded her. The tragedy of the Victorian era extended beyond the Queen's own heart, as the royal malady, haemophilia, began to surface within her descendants. This silent killer, carried through the female line, turned the expansion of the royal family into a slow-motion disaster. Victoria watched with growing dread as her children and grandchildren faced the fragility of their own lives. Each marriage and each birth became a source of anxiety rather than celebration, as the ancient British royal mystery of blood and inheritance took on a clinical, terrifying form. The Queen, once a symbol of stability, was now the source of a genetic legacy that would destabilize thrones across Europe. The first of Victoria's children to succumb to the cycle of tragedy was Princess Alice, the Grand Duchess of Hesse. In 1878, a wave of diphtheria swept through her household, claiming the life of her youngest daughter. Alice, driven by a mother's desperate love and ignoring all medical warnings, kissed her grieving son to comfort him, contracting the disease herself. She died on the 17th anniversary of her father's death, a cruel coincidence that devastated Victoria. Alice's death served as a grim reminder that no amount of royal power could shield the family from the sudden, pitiless hand of fate that seemed to haunt their bloodline. As Victoria aged, the losses continued to mount, chipping away at the foundation of her empire. Her youngest son, Leopold, who lived under the constant threat of his haemophilia, died suddenly after a fall, leaving the Queen to mourn yet another child. The tragic lineage of the British queens seemed to demand a heavy price for their long reigns. Victoria's journals from this period are a litany of sorrow, recorded with the meticulous detail of a woman who had become a professional at navigating the landscape of death. She was a monarch presiding over a court of shadows, where every milestone was marked by a vacant chair. By the late 1890s, the Queen Empress was a ghost of her former self, a living monument to a century of British history and royal heartbreak. She had survived her husband, several of her children, and many of her closest advisors. The weight of her crown was now literal, a physical burden on a body weary from decades of rule and mourning. The mystery of why her family was so plagued by early deaths and genetic misfortune remained unsolved, a dark thread woven into the tapestry of the Windsor name. Victoria remained the central figure of an age that was rapidly passing, clinging to the traditions of a world that no longer existed. In January 1901, the Victorian era finally drew to its close at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The Queen, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, including the future King Edward VII and Kaiser Wilhelm II, prepared to meet the end she had anticipated for 40 years. Her deathbed was a gathering of the European royalty she had helped shape, many of whom would soon face their own tragic fates in the coming century. As the Queen's breathing slowed, the air in the room felt heavy with the weight of the 19th century's collective grief, finally finding its resolution in the passing of its most enduring symbol. With the death of Queen Victoria, the crown passed to her son, Edward VII, but the shadow of her mourning lingered over the monarchy. The transition marked the end of the longest reign in British history to that point, a period defined by the tragic deaths of the queens and their families. As the Edwardian era began, the rituals of grief were slowly replaced by a new, modern sensibility, yet the underlying fragility of the royal lineage remained. The history of the British queens was a chronicle of sacrifice and sorrow, a legacy that would continue to haunt the halls of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle for generations to come. Queen Alexandra, consort to Edward VII, carried a quiet burden of sorrow. Though the Victorian era had closed, the spectre of loss remained a constant companion. The premature death of her eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, left a void that no royal pageantry could fill. Alexandra, known for her grace and beauty, began to retreat into a world of muffled silence as her hearing failed, mirroring the growing isolation of the crown. Her life was a bridge between the rigid mourning of the past and the uncertain, fast-paced world of the 20th century, where tragedy still stalked the palace halls. As the Edwardian summer faded into the grim reality of the 1910s, Queen Alexandra faced the ultimate loss of her husband, Edward VII. The king's death in 1910 stripped her of her role as consort, plunging her into a decade of mourning that echoed the long grief of her mother-in-law, Victoria. Alexandra found solace in the gardens of Sandringham, away from the prying eyes of a changing society. The world outside was spiralling toward a global conflict, but within the royal walls, the atmosphere remained heavy with the ancient British royal mystery of succession and the silent weight of a fading dynasty. The crown passed to George V and his consort, Mary of Teck. Queen Mary was the embodiment of Stoicism, a woman of iron will who navigated the horrors of the Great War with unwavering duty. Yet, behind the rigid posture and the layers of pearls lay a heart battered by the pressures of a crumbling European order. The tragic deaths of her royal cousins across the continent, particularly the Romanovs, served as a chilling reminder of the fragility of the throne. Mary's reign was defined by this silent endurance, a grim commitment to the monarchy, even as the world burned around her. Perhaps the most intimate tragedy of Queen Mary's life was the hidden struggle of her youngest son, Prince John. Afflicted by epilepsy and developmental delays, the lost prince was kept largely out of the public eye at Wood Farm. When he passed away at the age of 13 in 1919, the news was a shock to a nation that barely knew he existed. Mary's grief was private and profound, a mother's heartbreak buried beneath the heavy requirements of her station. This hidden death highlighted the cold reality of royal preservation, where family pain was often sacrificed for the public image. The death of King George V in 1936 brought Queen Mary into a new phase of mourning, but it was the subsequent abdication crisis that tested her resolve. As she watched her eldest son, Edward VIII, abandon the throne for Wallis Simpson, Mary felt the weight of a different kind of death, the death of duty and tradition. She stood as a pillar of the old world, a figure of ancient British royal mystery, watching the modern world fracture the institution she loved. Her life became a study in the tragic preservation of a legacy that seemed increasingly at odds with the era. Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, stepped into the role of consort during the Empire's most perilous hour. During the Blitz, she and George VI became symbols of resistance, refusing to leave London even as bombs fell. However, the tragedy of her reign was not found in the ruins of the city, but in the internal toll of leadership. She witnessed the slow decline of the British Empire and the personal sacrifices made by her family to keep the monarchy relevant. Her smile for the public masked a deep-seated anxiety about the survival of the crown in a radical, modern age. In 1952, the sudden death of George VI at the age of 56 thrust Elizabeth into the role of a young widow. The tragedy of losing her partner and king so unexpectedly was a turning point for the monarchy. As her daughter ascended the throne as Elizabeth II, the elder Elizabeth transitioned into the role of Queen Mother, a figure of continuity and quiet sorrow. She wore the black of mourning for years, her life now a testament to the endurance of the female line in the face of premature death. The halls of the palace felt emptier, haunted by the memory of the king. The tragedy of the royal lineage extended to the Queen Mother's younger daughter, Princess Margaret. Her life was a narrative of forbidden love and declining health, a stark contrast to the steady reign of her sister. Margaret's struggles with her public role and her internal unhappiness were a modern echo of the royal tragedies of the past. As her health failed in her later years, the image of the vibrant princess faded into one of isolation and physical fragility. Her story served as a reminder that the crown could be a heavy burden, even for those who did not wear it. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Queen Mother remained the final link to the Victorian and Edwardian worlds. Her longevity was both a miracle and a burden, as she outlived many of her peers and her own younger child. The deaths she had witnessed of husbands, siblings, and friends formed a chronicle of a century defined by loss. She stood as the matriarch of a family that had survived world wars and social upheavals, yet the underlying fragility of the royal lineage remained a constant. Her final years were spent in the quiet reflection of a life defined by ancient duty. The history of the British queens is a tapestry woven with threads of sacrifice, duty, and tragic death. From the early queens who faced execution to the modern consorts who navigated the pressures of a global stage, the legacy of the crown is inseparable from the sorrow of those who wore it. As the new millennium dawned, the cycles of grief continued to shape the monarchy, a reminder that the pursuit of power and the preservation of lineage often come at a terrible personal cost. The halls of Windsor and Buckingham remain repositories of these stories, silent witnesses to the tragic end of each royal chapter. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, spent her final days at Osborne House, the weight of her 64-year reign finally pressing down. Her death in 1901 marked the end of an era that had redefined the British Empire through industry and empire. Wrapped in the white veil she wore at her wedding, she sought a reunion with her beloved Albert in the afterlife. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed whispers of her gathered descendants. Her passing was not just the end of a life, but the closing of a century-long chapter of duty and personal sorrow. Queen Alexandra, the widow of the flamboyant Edward VII, lived a life increasingly isolated by her deafness and her persistent mourning. In the quiet corridors of Sandringham, she became a relic of a bygone Victorian age, surviving into a world transformed by the Great War. Her death in 1925 was the quiet fading of a once dazzling beauty who had endured the infidelities of her husband and the deaths of her children. Her story is one of silent resilience, a queen who watched her world vanish before she too was claimed by time and memory in the cold Norfolk winter. Queen Mary, the consort of George V, was the embodiment of royal duty and the legendary stiff upper lip. Her life was punctuated by the tragic deaths of her sons, including the young Prince John and later King George VI. Even as her own health failed in 1953, she insisted that the coronation of her granddaughter, Elizabeth II, should not be delayed by her death. Her passing marked the end of a rigid, Victorian moral order. She died as she lived, with stoic dignity, a formidable figure whose heart was a hidden repository of royal sorrows and ancestral secrets. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother remained a symbol of British defiance long after the smoke of the Blitz had cleared. Her long widowhood was a testament to her devotion to the memory of George VI and the stability of the crown. When she passed away at the age of 101 in 2002, the last living link to the Victorian era was severed. Her death was a moment of national reflection, a final goodbye to the Queen, who had stood firm during the kingdom's darkest hour. Her legacy was one of longevity, charm, and the hidden costs of royal survival. The sudden and violent end of Diana, Princess of Wales, though she was no longer a queen consort, shattered the traditional image of royal mortality. Her death in a Paris tunnel in 1997 forced the monarchy to confront a new kind of tragedy, one that played out in the glare of global cameras rather than behind palace walls. The outpouring of grief was unprecedented, a reminder that the women of the royal house are often symbols of the public's own hopes and heartbreaks. Her tragic end became a permanent scar on the crown's modern history, changing the monarchy forever. For Queen Elizabeth II, the year 2002 brought a dual weight of sorrow as she lost both her sister, Princess Margaret, and her mother within weeks of each other. These deaths left her as the sole remaining pillar of her immediate family, highlighting the profound isolation of the sovereign. The tragedy of these losses was felt deeply behind the closed doors of Windsor, where the Queen navigated her Golden Jubilee amidst personal mourning. This period reinforced the theme that even the most powerful queen must eventually face the silence of the tomb and the departure of her closest confidants. As the new millennium progressed, the shadow of death continued to linger over the royal household. The passing of Prince Philip, the Queen's strength and stay for over 70 years, marked the beginning of the final act for the second Elizabethan age. The image of the Queen sitting alone at his funeral during a global pandemic became a poignant symbol of royal grief and the inevitable loneliness of the crown. The weight of centuries of tragic deaths seemed to culminate in that single, solitary figure in the choir of St. George's Chapel, awaiting her own reunion with history. In the autumn of 2022, the long reign of Queen Elizabeth II came to its peaceful but momentous conclusion at Balmoral Castle. Her death was the final beat in a heart that had served the nation for 7 decades, surviving war, scandal, and personal loss. As the news spread across the globe, the cycle of royal tragedy and transition turned once more. She was the last of the great queens of the old world, a figure whose passing signalled the end of a long historic lineage of women who had worn the crown through blood, fire, and silent endurance. The history of the British queens is not merely a record of reigns and dates, but a chronicle of human suffering and sacrifice. From the scaffold at the Tower to the quiet beds of Windsor, the deaths of these women have shaped the soul of a nation. Each tragedy, whether it was the execution of a young queen or the quiet passing of an elderly monarch, added a new layer to the tapestry of the crown. The ghosts of these queens remain in the stones of the palaces, their stories a reminder that power is always purchased with the currency of personal peace. As the book closes on this chapter of British history, the legacy of its queens remains an inseparable part of the national identity. The tragedies they endured and the deaths that claimed them have become the stuff of legend, woven into the very fabric of the monarchy. The crown continues to pass from head to head, carrying with it the weight of every sacrifice made by those who came before. In the end, the history of the queens is a story of duty above all else, a cycle of life and death that remains as mysterious and enduring as the crown itself.